And the crowd calms. Well, I'll let you, in your silence, it's interesting up here. You get a little bit of everybody's conversation, and as it it builds and builds into a little crescendo, and then all of a sudden, everyone at once just sort of, okay, we're ready now. So since you're ready, I am. So good afternoon. Welcome to the Draper Natural History Lunchtime Expeditions program for August. And yes, I'm back, but only only for this presentation, I think. I appreciate Gretchen and Corey letting me step in. And I will tell you that retirement is not overrated. It is a good thing. I'm busier than I was. I don't know when I had time to work. I mean, to actually come into the building, but I'm keeping busy, and it's been fun. It's great to be back here and see so many familiar faces among you, and especially today to introduce a good friend of mine and colleague today. For those of you who don't know, though, I'm Chuck Preston. I am now the founding and senior curator emeritus of the Draper Natural History Museum. It's like I say, it's really great to be back with you. Let me remind you, if you haven't already, if you'll turn your phones or other electronic devices that might beep or cheep or do something, hopefully not tweet, during this time and interrupt our speaker. So let me tell you a little bit about our speaker today. He is an emeritus. Boy, we're using that word a lot lately. Yeah, pretty good. He doesn't know how to retire either, but he's enjoying it. I know that. But he's an emeritus scientist with U.S. Geological Survey in Boise, Idaho. And he's also an adjunct faculty member at Boise State University. He's maintained that appointment for some years. He's been studying various facets of raptor ecology for the past 50 years now. Specifically, and I hope some of you are familiar with this, if not yet, you will be by the end of this talk, the Morley-Nelson Snake River Birds of Prey National Conservation Area. It's a mouthful, but it's a fascinating place, as you'll see today, and it's unique. And he has had a unique career because of that. And I think that conservation area is so much better off for what he and his colleagues have done over the last 50 years. He received his bachelor's degree in wildlife management from Purdue University way back in 1969. That's when I was graduating from high school, by the way. So you are older than I am. And master's in wildlife ecology from University of Idaho in 1972. Where he studied nesting ecology and chemical contamination of golden eagles in southwestern Idaho. The Bureau of Land Management hired him in 1972 as he was finishing his master's degree to be the very first biologist in what is now that National Conservation Area. That enabled him to continue his work on golden eagles in southwestern Idaho, which he continues today, literally, still working at it. Through all of these years, and that is almost unprecedented. I can't think of many other scientists in the world in any field who have had that kind of longevity and continuity and the kind of insights that comes with it's tough to get any kind of a long-term study going anyway with funding the way it is. So this is a unique situation, and the scientific community certainly has benefited from it. So among other things today, he'll reaffirm for you something that I think I've alluded to in the past in some of my talks. Just when you think you know all the answers, nature throws you a curve when you're doing long-term studies. And I think that's one of the most exciting things in a way, because it tells you, wow, we still have more to know. So please welcome my friend and colleague, Mike Kochert.
Wow. That's going to be a tough act to follow. But I really want to thank Chuck for inviting me to give this presentation. I want to thank the staff at the Draper Natural History Museum, particularly Gretchen, and the rest of the staff for just treating me very well and just taking care of everything I need. And if you haven't seen the display of golden eagles in the Draper, it's fantastic. And kudos to Chuck and everybody else that put that together. I'm absolutely amazed. Today I'd like to take you through a little bit of history of my experiences for the last half century. What I want to do today is to introduce you to golden eagles, talk a little bit about the life history, and I know there's people in the audience like Jordan Harrison and others that are going to get bored with this. Just bear with me. But we're going to walk through a little bit of eagle biology. Then we're going to go into the work that we've done for the last 50 years and answer the question, what have we learned? And I kind of think you're going to be impressed. Most of you probably know this, that the golden eagle has a holarctic distribution, essentially worldwide in the northern hemisphere, north of 20 degrees latitude. There's 6 subspecies of golden eagles worldwide, 1 subspecies in North America, and that's the canadensis subspecies. It is one of 2 species of of eagles that occur in North America regularly, even though we have a couple vagrant species, the Steller's eagle and the white-tailed eagle, but it's one of the 2 species that occupy the area, the other species being the bald eagle. What's unique about both species is that they're protected by special legislation. They're protected by the Bald and Golden Eagle Act that was initially passed, I believe, Chuck, in 1948? Yes, 48. What that means is that golden eagles have a special protection, way more than the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And so we'll be talking a little bit about some of that protection. Golden eagles are impressive because they use a wide variety of habitats, ranging all the way from the Arctic to the deserts, and up to altitudes of 3,600 meters, which I think that's roughly 12,000 feet if I'm ciphering correctly. Hard to do things in my head anymore. Because I was an undergrad during the 60s. Need I say any more? I think so. As you see, and anybody that's been out in Chuck's study area, they breed in open and semi-open habitats, and they really avoid dense forests. Even though you'll find them in Washington nesting in forested areas, you'll usually find them nesting in open parts of that forest. They nest mainly on cliffs, but also in trees. I think Ross Crandall is here today, and he has essentially 50% in trees and 50% on cliffs. But in most of the area, they nest on cliffs. But I've even had, during my studies, have them nest on the ground, and we've had them nest on human-made structures. The characteristics, most people know what a golden eagle looks like. Big, large raptor, dark brown coloration, golden hackles. The characteristic that separates it from the bald eagles, it has a feathered tarsus and a tricolored bill. Yes, it can be confused with the immature bald eagle. But if you look at this picture of the bald eagle here, one distinguishing characteristic is that the bald eagle has a much longer neck. And so you can pretty well tell them in the wild. You know, there's different plumage characteristics of adults, immatures, and juveniles. The juveniles that you can see over on the right-hand side of the screen, they're right after they fledge, they're very dark, almost black. And the immatures have the distinguishing characteristic of the white at the base of the primaries and the secondaries, white at the base of the tail. The golden eagle essentially is just basically all dark and light-colored primaries. I won't go into the absolute details because my name is not Bill Clark. Let's talk a little bit about golden eagles, and they are probably the consummate case-selected or the case strategist. That means they're long-lived, In captivity, they can live up to 50 years. They have a low reproductive rate. Basically, the brood size is mainly about 2, but it ranges from 1 to 3, and rarely, of 4 individuals. They have a delayed maturation. They enter into breeding plumage of about 4 years of age. I have had, over the years, documented that we've had 4-year-old individuals breed, but as I was telling Chuck yesterday, we've had some individuals that looked like they were in 2 to 3 year, those pre-definitive classes of about 2 to 3 years old, mated with an adult bird and raising young. So anyway, they do have a delayed maturation. Another thing about a K strategist is that they have a high adult survival rate, and that is really important as far as the Fish and Wildlife Service management, because if they can increase survival rate of adults, they are getting more bang for their buck, but they're also interested in increasing survival of the juveniles or immatures as well. I just want to know, can everybody hear me okay? If you can't, just yell out. I'm hard of hearing because I won't hear you. But anyway, and because of their K strategy, the way that they react to reduced resources, prey resources, is they just forego egg laying. And the threats are basically like most other raptors. Habitat alteration is a real big threat to the golden eagle. And now this is something that I wasn't even concerned about when I started a half century ago. Climate change. We didn't even know what climate change was. But this was the third one. Anthropogenic factors was a big one in the 70s. Well, as Chuck is saying, every time you study something, you find out something that you didn't expect. And this is one of the things that I saw in a 2016 report from the Fish and Wildlife Service. I was blown away that the main anthropogenic mortality factor of golden eagles was shooting. I couldn't believe it. If this was the 1970s, and if this was in New Mexico or something like that, yeah, I'd believe it. But no, here it is, right there. And it is, what's tragic about it, it's preventable. Don't pull the trigger. But I guess some habits are hard to break. As you can see, there's a myriad of anthropogenic factors. One of them being a concern, but also being considered as a means of mitigation, is this lead toxicosis, lead poisoning from consuming a lot of times gut piles, and in animals shot with lead shot or lead bullets. Okay. Now that I gave you a quick rundown on golden eagles and a little bit about their life history, let's get into talking about what did we learn over this, what did we learn in this last 50 years. As you can see from this collage of pictures, we have used all kinds of techniques to study the birds, and much like Chuck and his staff has been doing, one of the things though that I have noticed in these last years, over this from the 70s on, is that the technology has increased, has gotten better, and we can answer more complex questions. So that is what we're looking at, and that eagle on your left-hand side of the screen is wearing something that came about, and it's a GPS satellite transmitter. Back when I started, we were using UHF ground-based telemetry, so that just shows that. Well, let's get into it. Golden eagles have been studied in the Southwest Idaho since 1966. When Gary Hickman was with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, well, it was actually the Bureau of Sport, Fisheries, and Wildlife then, animal damage control, because of the concerns about mass shooting of golden eagles in primarily the Trans-Pecos and in New Mexico. And at that time, they thought all eagles wintered down there, and if you're shooting a lot of eagles there, you're really affecting the population. So this stimulated surveys. One of them was in Southwest Idaho, and that was attributed to the knowledge that a person by the name of Morley Nelson had. As you can see, this work continued as 2 graduate studies. One of them was my graduate study. And I was fortunate enough, as Chuck says, to be hired by the BLM so I could continue my graduate work. And as you can see here, various entities have conducted the work, and I've worked for all of them one way or another. And if you look at this one, this thing called NBS, this is the National Biological Service. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but I have the dubious distinction of being a charter member of the shortest lived agency in the Department of the Interior, National Biological Service, and I have a plaque showing that. But anyway, this gives you an idea of the entities involved and how this has continued. And I just, as Chuck, I think you mentioned, this year marks my 50th consecutive field season. I'm working on those golden eagles in Southwest Idaho. And it's been an interesting ride. When I showed up, as a graduate student, my hair was a bit darker, and there was considerably more of it. And one thing I've learned over these past 50 years is that Father Time is not kind, and the guy has a twisted sense of humor. Then let's get serious. Okay, as Chuck has mentioned too, even though we're studying golden eagles in Southwest Idaho, and we have 85 historical territories that we've been studying, the main focus, and like Chuck has that intensive area, our main focus has been in this, and I'm just going to call it the NCA, because the Morley Nelson that's a long title. So, and a little bit about the area. It is basically a shrub steppe, salt desert shrub, Sonoran Desert, Upper Sonoran Desert. And the main geological feature is the Snake River Canyon. So as opposed to the studies out here in Wyoming, we are looking at eagles pretty much on a linear basis. The distribution is linear. So you get away from the canyon. So that has a lot of means a lot more than if you're out here where your distribution is clustered or randomly distributed. Well, let's talk about a little bit of some of the biology of the eagles in Southwest Idaho. First of all, they're non-migratory, like many of the eagles south of 50 degrees latitude. And but as Chuck pointed out, sometimes you get thrown a curve, because we have a bird that we instrumented, a male, in 2014, and that bird did not read the book, because in August of his second year that we had him online, he decided he had enough of Southwest Idaho and ended up in Casper, Wyoming. He spent a month basically from August through September in Casper, and then he came back to southern Idaho. He came back, did not go to his territory. He wintered north of his territory, about I'd say about 25 miles, 30. But he wasn't in his territory. He wasn't maintaining and protecting it. And he showed up the next spring, mated with a bird on his former territory, and that's unheard of. And he did it again for a second year. So basically, this bird didn't read the book. It's obvious from that one. The nesting season in Southwest Idaho is essentially like a lot of the other areas where eagles reside. We have essentially, it's January when you have courtship, nest building, and it's July when the latest young fledge. And then what we have is a 3 to 6 month post-fledging period where the young learn their skills and everything. And we have young eagles there that are very much like human adolescents. You look at some of these, those resident birds could not get that kid to leave. And he was there for 6 months. We had one, we had a PTT on it, It was even after January. And the parents are going, hold it, we got another brood to raise here. What are you doing? But it happens that way. Sometimes it did, and then others will leave within 2 or 3 months. They're out of there. And one of the things that we found that nest building, a lot of times it's pretty quick, but it may take up to 3 months. You know, when I say nest building, they're not building a new nest, they're refurbishing a nest, putting the lining in, and sometimes it'll be 3 months before they finish it up. They're not in a big hurry. One of the things that Mike Colopy found out is that both sexes participate in the nest building, and here's what's interesting, it can occur all season. Just this year, and I observed it in 2012, we've had 2 cases where the nest failed. I guess these eagles didn't have anything else to do. They built a totally new nest. The one that did it in 2012, they waited to 2017 before they laid an egg in it. And the one that we observed this year was robbing nest material from a neighboring nest to put in this nest that they're building. And I'm going, this doesn't make sense. But you will see them building nests pretty much all year round. Egg laying, as I said, that the clutch size, clutch size is 1 to 3 eggs, and it's rarely 4. I had a nest one time that had 4 eggs, but it consisted of 2 separate clutches, and which is very, very rare. We basically have about 40 days or so between the earliest laying date and the latest laying date. And one of the things, the incubation period is basically, for rough calculations, about 6 weeks. And one thing that Mike Colopy reported is that mostly the female incubates. So when somebody looks up at a nest and says, oh, well, the female's incubating, they have a high probability that they're right, but it's not 100% because the male will spell the female and incubate. One thing that's important to keep in mind, it's asynchronous hatching. That means the eggs do not hatch on the same day. You'll have 2 to 4 days between hatching of the first egg, second egg, and then if you have a 3 egg clutch, there's a wide span between that first and last egg. And they rarely re-nest. We've had 2 cases in all these years where we had eagles lay a second clutch. That one was the nest that had 4, another one failed and was able to fledge 1 young. Okay, you noticed I mentioned this about the asynchronous hatching. The downside with asynchronous hatching is that when food resources are lacking, the nesting attempt will experience a phenomenon called fratricide or siblicide, where the older sibling will kill the younger sibling. There's even been cases reported where the adult, assuming the female, would actually kill the youngest one that's in bad shape. And this is when prey resources are low, and feed that chick or that youngster to the older surviving young. But this is a case here where you got the young one there just either starved or succumbed to its older sibling. And if you have a case where there's 2 young in a nest, and the oldest is a female, so she's older, hatched a few days older, she's bigger, and you're the second one is the male, and you better hope there's a lot of food out there because you've got a rough time ahead of you, because that big female could basically kill that youngster. Anyway, Mike Colopy was a graduate student that worked with us in the late 70s, and he was basically looking at parental and nestling behavior. And some of the stuff they came up with is that the female does most of the work in terms of at the nest. And you can see she feeds, she shades young. The male, I guess some people would say is the typical male. He's out hunting. But the female will hunt as the nesting season progresses. The youngs are gaining in size. The food demands are high. They'll be out hunting as well. And you can see the prey deliveries increase during the nesting season. and the young starts to feed itself at 5 weeks. But I've seen adults feed this huge 7-week-old youngster going, oh boy, kind of reminds me of some folks' again, adolescent kids. So anyway, in terms of the fledging period, some of the information that we learned over the years is that young will leave the nest. We've had them leave the nest as early as 45 days. And as you can see from this chart, it's a progression that moves up, and the height of departure is around 65 days. The average date for fledging is about 64. But you'll see young will start leaving the nest right around 50 to 51 days, and some as early as 45. So that's why we use 51 days as our excuse me, as our measure of whether a nest is successful or not. If they raised at least one young to 51 days, then we call them successful. And any mortality after that is a post-fledging mortality. And then we've gathered some information on the post-fledging period. And as I said, some of the young they depart early, they're out of there. Some of them stay for a long time. And during this post-fledging period, the adults supplementally feed the young, but also the young learn their hunting skills. Some learn quicker than others, and they're out. But like I say, it's almost, most of the time, it's somewhere between 3 and 5 months. We've gathered some information on natal dispersal. And now what natal dispersal, the definition of natal dispersal is the distance from where the young were hatched to the site of their first breeding. And basically have found that natal dispersal is pretty much within the study area. With the distances have ranged from 7 to 65 kilometers. But we've never had a nesting marked bird or marked bird nesting outside of the Southwest Idaho study area. This suggests to me there's a lot of natal philopatry, tendency to go back to where you were reared. And the age, like I said, we've had some that marked birds that they were 4 years old at their first breeding, some of them up to 7 years. But to take, hello? Okay. Some of the other work we did was in terms of golden eagle nest use. And as probably most of you know, eagles use a number of nests with, when I say eagles, eagle pairs, there's a number of nests of alternative nests within a nesting territory. The paper that we put out in 2012 showed that some of our territories, the nests used ranged from 1 to 18. But the mean was about 7. And this territory with the 18 nests, some of those they only used once, and if we go out today, they're gone. But that shows that there was a lot of nest building going on. The time between reuse, and this is important as far as golden eagle management, because one of the things that the BLM and other agencies are concerned about is if we have a development here and the nest has not been used in a certain degree of time, can we remove the nest? Will it, and that's based on the assumption it will not be reused. Well, if you see this, we had one nest that was laid unused for 39 years. And this year it got beat by another nest, and this one hadn't been used in 45 years. Now, the one that hadn't been used in 45 years was only a few meters from another alternative nest that was used quite a bit. But for some reason, for 45 years, they didn't want to move that 2 or 3 meters to use this other nest. But what this points out is that using a 7 or 10, a 12 or 15 year level of saying, okay, it hadn't been used in 15 years, let's get rid of it. I caution people on that, but that's just me. One of the things we found with this work is that nests were used, some nests were only used once, and a lot of them were. But there was one nest that was used 26 times over 46 years. That territory only had 2 nests in it. Where they had plenty of cliff to build nests, I just don't know what, they just used this one. They must have liked it. One thing that we found that was interesting is that the eagles tended to change nest after the turnover of at least one member of the pair. It must be the new mate came in and said, hello, that was your old mate's nest. I don't want it. I want to go over here. But that's what we've seen. And switching was not really associated to the previous year's success. And what was interesting, too, that although nests were used that year, and most of the times we see this, they build a nest, they will use it that year if it was done in the spring or the following nesting season. But we had cases where they hadn't used a nest for up to 6, 7, 10, 12, 10 to 11 years. So that also has some information in terms of how you manage golden eagles. Now, some of the work that we did dealt with predator-prey relationships. And some of our early stuff, this was a paper that we published in the Journal of Animal Ecology, and what we found is that golden eagles preferred jackrabbits. What that meant is that if there was a jackrabbit out there, they were going to find it. We also had a subsequent paper that showed that golden eagle productivity was tied closely to jackrabbit abundance. Again, that response of golden eagles to jackrabbit abundance changes. And this had a real application to what I'm going to talk about in a minute here, is that jackrabbits suffered negatively by the loss of shrub habitat. I wouldn't say jackrabbits are shrub obligates, but you get rid of the shrubs, you get rid of jackrabbits. So I'll say that much. And I think that Chuck and anybody else that's worked out in the areas, and I guess you have that kind of habitat relationship with cottontails? Okay. And so there's that shrub component within golden eagle territories is very important. Let's talk a little bit about what has happened to the shrubs. And this was an area of study that we really capitalized on. It was fortuitous, but we capitalized on it. The area, like I say, is really used to be, and you notice I said used to be, a really great shrub steppe habitat, but, and I can't go through the long history of how habitat changed because I got it. So the hook comes out at when? 15 minutes or so. Okay. Oh, come on, I can read that watch. Or whatever that thing is up there. Oh, okay. These people want to know what's going on. Starting in basically about 1970s, the area was started to be subjected to fire. What had happened is the area was, and like a lot of the other places, was invaded by the alien plants, the alien plant species. And when I say they were invaded, the area was invaded by the aliens, I didn't mean Martians. Alien plants such as cheatgrass, Russian thistle, and that alike. The cheat was first identified in what is now the NCA in 1900. By the 1950s, the cheatgrass was all over the place, and by the 1970s, this is what happened. We had massive fires, large fires, hot fires, and this is what we end up with. We ended up with a monoculture of essentially cheatgrass. Well, as I said, these burn events were kind of fortuitous because prior to 1980, the area was pretty quiet. They actually were calling the area where the NCA was the asbestos resource area because it rarely burned, and you can see this. The incidence of fire was really low up to 1980. That window of time between 1981 and 1985 was a high well, there were years of high moisture, particularly in the winter and the spring. Those were the years when Salt Lake became Venice. We had all of these water going down the streets and everything like that, and they were pumping water out of the Great Salt Lake. So it was very wet springs. So consequently, the extent of fires was high, the size of fires was large, and as you can see here, a large proportion of the territories were burned, a large area within the territories were burned. Then you can see later from 1986 to 94, again, back to a low incidence of fire. This set up a real natural experimental design of pre-burn, burn, and post-burn. And so this gave us a chance to study that, and what did we find? We found that success declined to really a low level at 4 to 6 years after the burn. But what we observed is that it subsequently increased and to pretty much pre-burn levels of 10 to 11 years after the burns. And then one of the things we did in this paper, this was a paper published in 1999 in the Journal of Wildlife Management, we suggested long-term monitoring, and as you can see, that long-term monitoring has continued. Let's see some of the results over the years. What has happened out there? Now that we know it's burned, well, one of the things that we've shown is that there's been a significant decline in the number of occupied territories in the area. And as you can see, it's been kind of stair-step. You've got some decline. The number of territories remains stable for a while, then you get a decline, but it's still a significant decline. One of the things we observed is that if a territory remains vacant for more than 5 years, the probability of it being reoccupied is going to be low. So but bottom line is I really don't get worried if a territory is vacant a year or two, but if we're looking at a long period of time, and some of these territories that we've pretty much written off have been vacant for over 45 years. So the likelihood of them being reoccupied is pretty low, but there's always hope. Well, as opposed to the number of occupied territories, the number of young fledged, and again, this is all for the NCA, the Intensive Study Area, so keep in mind it's just part of our Southwest Idaho study area. As opposed to the number of occupied territories, the number of young fledged has remained took a nosedive right during the years of the burn. And the productivity there was extremely low. But as you can see, it bounced back, and since 1993, it's been bouncing around the long-term mean. This caused us to start wondering, what's going on out there? You saw in that one, in the previous table, that 27 territories were burnt to some degree. And yet, we've had them bounce back, and they're not completely up to the high years, but they're doing really well. Well, one of the things we found out is that half of the young are produced in about a quarter of the territories. And I don't think, that has been seen with other raptor species, is that you basically have a core of good territories producing most or all of the young. Okay, well, what did we find with our long-term monitoring? Number one, we concluded that there was a reduced carrying capacity for the NCA. We saw that. We had a significant decline in the number of occupied territories. However, the population, the ones that are there, seem to be reducing at a normal rate. We also saw that there was a core of productive pairs producing most of the young. And excuse me, we were also surprised to see that the most productive territories burned extensively, that had burned in the 80s, burned again between 1995 and 2013. And I'll get to what we saw in a bit. So keep in mind, we had a fire regime again, burning. These results that we looked at it and we said, these results suggest an adaptation of these eagles to these altered environments. But how? I kind of really made us wonder, how have these eagles adapted to these changes? And we did a lot of head scratching. That's why I don't have much left. And so, what's some of the stuff we found? Well, John Marsliff was doing a radiotelemetry study. And one of the things he found that how these birds responded to loss of shrub habitat, some of them expanded their home range and sought shrub patches that contain jackrabbits. So like I said, they select for they have a preference for jackrabbits, and if there's a rabbit out there, they'll find it. However, some of them restricted their range and took alternative prey, which I'll get into in a little bit. And it was not prey that we suspected. Okay, when I said that they expanded their territories, we observed a phenomenon that we called subsuming. This subsuming is where a territory that's a pair that's occupying a territory will actually subsume the neighboring territory, just take it over. And here's an example. You see in the circle in yellow below, that's the Swan 1 territory in the 70s and in the 80s, early 80s, or excuse me, the 80s. You got Swan Dam up to the north. Well, Swan Dam became vacant. What happened here is you got Swan, we're assuming this is Swan 1, but you have now a cluster of nests that are in between there. So what we have is a situation where we have two territories being that once at one time were occupied by two pairs is now occupied by one pair. Those territories are occupied by one pair now. So that's the way we've seen it as far as the distribution of nest and nest cliff use. We also saw it spatially. And if you look at this, we were fortunate enough to be doing some radiotelemetry work in the 1970s and then again in the 1990s. And if you see the dotted line is the historical feedlot territory. The feedlot territory became vacant in 1990, but then you see what happened in the 1990s when Bearcase was, that pair was instrumented. Oh, and by the way, I'm not going to go into any detail how that territory got to be named Bearcase. So anyway, you can see what's happened here is that the Bearcase home range encompasses 90% of the former home range of the feedlot territory. So here it is. Spatially, what Bearcase essentially did, it's too bad we didn't have information on their range size, home range size in the 70s, but it looks to me like they did what Marsliff predicted. They expanded their range, and in this area, there's a lot of shrub patches out there. So let's go back. Yet still, we were scratching our heads saying, okay, they've done this subsuming, but what are they eating now? Because some of these didn't do that. And they were nesting in some of the most trashed out habitat in the world. Well, what are they eating now? Well, to do that, we initiated in 2014 and 2015 a dietary change study where we sampled the same nests that we studied in the 1970s and called that, in the 1970s, that span of time where it consisted of the pre-burn years. And then we considered the 2014 to 2015, the post-burn years. We replicated the techniques that we used in the 70s. That means we collected prey remains and regurgitated pellets at a systematic interval. In addition, Jordan Harrison installed nest cams for us, and so that we could actually enumerate prey using the new cameras to augment and to use in addition to the conventional dietary assessments. And Jordan published that paper just recently, and some of the things he found was, number one, and we suspected this, but we showed it quantitatively, that we underestimated small prey by using the pellet count, analyzing prey remains in pellets. We also way underestimated snakes. So anyway, and as you can see, I think you're using cameras now, Chuck, and Ross Crandall's using, and people now are really using cameras because that's the way to do it. You're really getting a lot of neat information. We also got information on mortality. I hope maybe we got it stuff. But here is what we found. Now I want you to focus, and I'll use this gizmo right here. In the pre-burn years, they were taking almost, half of their diet consisted of a legomorph, mountain cottontail and black-tailed jackrabbits. Well, let's see what they did in the post-burn years. Black-tailed jackrabbits and mountain cottontails were way less. Look what filled in here, two species that never even showed up because they were in the 80% additional species. Mallards and coots had an increase in yellow-bellied marmots and an increase in pigeons. And I was sitting in the lab one day, and Julie Huth, my cohort in crime for this study, came in and she said, "Kochert, you really look bummed out." And I said, "Yeah, you'd be bummed out if your regal eagle species stooped to eating coots." But they are like the rest of us. Those eagles were trying to make a living the best way they could, and they were doing it. They were nesting in trashed out habitat and still producing kids. So they were hunting the riverine habitat. Okay, so let's see some of the summary findings. And they made significant shifts in diet in both composition and diversity. In other words, the diet they were taking more prey, more diverse types of prey in the post-burn years. So they just expanded their repertoire of prey. The greatest change, again, was in composition and diversity, occurred in the burned territories, which you'd suspect. Here's what was interesting. The proportion of jackrabbits in the diet was related positively to nesting success. Coming back to this whole thing that eagles prefer jackrabbits or legomorphs. And we're doing the Birds of Prey, the Birds of North America chapter for golden eagles. We also found that they also thrive on on skyurids. That would be prairie dogs like around here, marmots like in the upstream comparison area of our area. So, but this was interesting. We found that in our area, jackrabbits are still important, even though they're taken less. However, some of these dietary changes may not have desirable consequences. And some of the factors, and this will show out in some of the factors that influence nesting survival. Julie Heath has joined the team in 2013, and she's a professor at Boise State, and she's actually taking over. Her lab is taking over the lead of the eagle monitoring. But she's also was interested in factors influencing nesting survival. So she had a graduate student working on those aspects of it. And one of them was disease. And also they looked at ectoparasites. And then Karen and I and Jesse Brown we were looking at thermal stress. One of the things and Ben Dudak was Julie's graduate student, and found that 41% of the golden eagles in southwest Idaho showed symptoms of trichomoniasis. Trichomoniasis. And trichomoniasis is fatal in golden eagles. It is a protozoan disease that is caused by the protozoan Trichomonas gallinae. And the eagles, it infects the upper buccal cavity. Basically, the eaglets starve. And so basically, if we see a bird with the definite case, what did I do? Sorry about that, folks. Can't turn me loose. Okay, with the particular the plaques or the caseous lesions, you can pretty well write them off. So this really showed that these dietary shifts, in Julie's mind, and it stands to reason, have a potential to affect golden eagle survival. But the bright side bright side is that trichomoniasis can be treated with the anti-protozoan drugs. Spartex, we used Emtrol, and actually you treat them, you come back and check to see how everything works. If you have to, treat them again, and they survive. And this technique has potential as a technique for offset mitigation for wind energy. And when I say offset mitigation, that's increasing survival over here so you can compensate for mortality over here, over in another place. Let's talk about the effects, and Ben also worked on the effects of parasites. And the nest in that area, some nests are just riddled with Mexican chicken bugs. That's a Cymicidae. It's the same genus as the human bed bug. And Ben found that the birds in highly infested nests had lower weights, higher, and lower hematocrit or red blood count, and it was an increased probability that they would either fledge early, and a lot of times as they fledged early, as you can see in this picture here, the outcome is not good. This particular bird did fine until the sudden stop at the bottom, and then he was gone. And basically, I think he was old enough. If he would have just righted himself, he probably could have fluttered down. But it's tough to do it when you're upside down. Also, parasitized nestlings had a higher corticosteroid level, which means they were stressed. And see, I was pretty much in the old days a non-believer. All those cooties aren't hurting those birds at all. Well, now I've changed my tune. I think we've got, in certain nests, problems. And however, Ben found that some of these eagles tried to offset that by using aromatic nesting material, primarily gray rabbit brush. And he sampled out in the area around the nest. He found that there was a selection for gray rabbit brush. So if it was there, eagles are trying to use it. We just published a paper on the effects of nest exposure, and we found that this really affects nestling survival in hot years. And here's what we found. We found that when the temperature stays below 90 degrees Fahrenheit, everything's okay. There's really no difference between, right here, between the survival of nestlings and in shaded nests versus exposed nests. As you can see, the lower level here is the exposed nest, the upper shaded nest. However, when you get cumulative days, and you can see cumulative up to, with this graph, up to 8 days cumulative during the nesting season, survival tanks. But the birds in the shaded nest. What this means is that installation of shade structures has a potential to be, again, another means of using for offset mitigation. So the wind industry is really interested in what we're doing here. Another project that we worked on, and this is going to be our last one that I'm going to talk to you about so you can wake up, is a project that we did in the, essentially we did it for, in the 80s. And this was, we actually recorded the, hello, Chuck.
Just stretching?
Yeah, just stretching. Anyway, we recorded the colonization of the 500 kV line by raptors. And we found that golden eagles utilized these structures, utilized the platforms that were installed by the power company, and that that nesting success was higher in these platforms than in other parts of the tower. One last project that I lied to you, that Julie Heath is working on, is the effects of OHVs on nesting activity of golden eagles. And what we found here is that, yes, eagle productivity was reduced in impacted area, OHV impacted areas. In other words, OHVs had an effect in golden eagle reproduction. But what we really found out and was really surprised is that early season pedestrians had an effect on whether eagles laid eggs or not. And I think this is a situation. They did nothing but count these OHVs going by, but when they stopped and this biped predator started walking around, they got freaked out. Okay, Chuck says I got to quit.
Oh, yeah, make me the bad guy.
Well, I am going to make you the bad guy. I better stand here. I'm told to stay in front of this thing. What I've done is I've walked you through, no, I ran you through 50 years. And what was it, 50 minutes? Yeah. And if I talked like an auctioneer, that's the way it goes. But I think we've discovered a lot. We've discovered much, but what we've also done is we found there's much more to be discovered. We are still faced with a situation the habitat is still in a depauperate condition. The BLM has been working for decades to try to restore that area, to restore it back to the way it was in 1979. It is a very difficult task. You're talking in the Bruno area, and that area is a 6 to 8 inch precip zone. It's very difficult to plant anything to get it to grow. Then once it does grow, you have fires coming along, the invasion of cheatgrass. So anyway, I'm going to stop here. Oh, I do have to acknowledge everybody. So let's do that. Over the last 50 years, it's been, just like Chuck's study, a contribution of many people. I look at this effort much like I look at a Cecil B. DeMille movie. It was an effort conducted by a cast of thousands. And a lot of great people, a lot of good stuff was found. So do I have time to entertain questions?
Absolutely.
Okay.